Today's video is brought to you by Audible. Audible provides an easily accessible way to access audiobooks for its members, just one of the reasons why I recommend it, along with enabling you to make huge savings on the newest full-length Warhammer audiobooks. As an Audible member, you get 1 credit every month to use on any title across their entire premium selection, but clearly credits best spent on those longer 9-hour plus premium audiobooks. Often, when choosing audiobooks to have a listen to, I end up looking at those Tales from the Heresy or 40k classic narratives. So I wanted to choose this month something brand new, Void King. Given the focus on rogue traders in the last video, this brand new story just came out and it deals with the inception of the Indomitus Crusade, as our rogue trader is tasked in finding a route across the Great Rift, the Cicatrix Maledictum. I'll have a little more about this choice at the end of today's video, and you can start today using Audible with a free 30-day Audible trial to get yourself full access to thousands of audiobooks, originals and podcasts. All you need to do is visit audible.com/Lutin, and for those in the US you can also text Lutin to 500 500. The low breeze caught in the mane of her hair, which flared behind her like black fire. Now, with the prey so tantalizingly close to being within striking distance of her favoured blades, Yathander saw and processed further details of her enemy. The armour was not only black, it was also ebon, trimmed and fashioned with bone in fact. So too its helmet, which resembled a dour skull, and in the pits of those cold and lifeless sockets, Yathander would often look into the eyes of her victims as she killed them. She enjoyed the pleasure of witnessing the terror there and the stark realization that this was their last moment of existence. She revelled in the sense of power it gave her. But the black and bone warrior betrayed none of this. The eyes only burned, and incredulous as it was to her, Yathander discovered in those few final seconds before combat that she was the one that felt fear. No, not just fear. Sheer, unreasoning dread. Like a shade drawn from the shadow realm of Elendrak, Yathander beheld an apparition before her. The edges of its armour shimmered and smoked as if they too were aflame, and bled slowly into the mist, becoming part of it. Flesh and blood enemies she knew how to fight, but an incorporeal wraith. Something happened then. During the crashing cascade of realization and emotion that had never happened to Yathander before, she faltered. The razor flails whipped out, driven by momentum, 2 lashing tongues of hellsteel, but failed to land a blow. Half staggering by now, she was undone by her own failed acrobatics and gaped in disbelief as the razor flail simply passed through it. Her eyes widened as the black and bone warrior seemed to disappear and reappear as if it wore an Archon's flicker field and was abruptly within reach. Despite the evidence of her eyes to the contrary, Yathander refuted that she had been outmaneuvered. The feeling did not last. It was replaced by another, pain. It began as a warm sensation in her torso and grew needle sharp in seconds as she realized she had fought her last duel, and though she hated herself for it, cursing inwardly as her precious soul was released into the warp, and to she who thirsts, she cried out as weak as the wretches she had once so gleefully culled. The Legion of the Damned remain a rarely spoken mythical legend among the Astartes. Rarely spoken because their true origin and agenda is unknown. Mentioning such apparitions could be considered heretical by some, for they only ever seem to appear as ghost-like entities who will appear to aid another Astartes or Imperial servants in moments of extreme criticality. They appear to aid desperate battles and are documented as having done so on numerous occasions. When it comes to the Legion of the Damned, there is certainly no shortage of speculation as to their origins, although there's actually plenty of information out there about them, you just have to, look it up. So I'll cover the information available, and just for the sake of it, some of the common speculations, even though many have been relatively debunked, although how much that can actually happen in 40k is another matter. You can decide for yourself which you believe to be the most plausible. I'm always interested in your thoughts when it comes to these speculative ideas, so be sure to tell me which one you believe and why in the comments of this video today, or if you had any other original ideas as to their origin also. The Legion of the Damned are one of those curious things in 40k. I put them up there with the Baneblade scout tanks in some respect because there's actually plenty of material that helps to define them. Like I said, you just have to kind of actually go and find and read it. See, for example, Flame and Damnation, for starters. The most established core theme of the Legion of the Damned is that they only appear at moments when a crushing defeat appears all but certain. They appear out of nowhere, often immediately initiating an engagement. One of their most terrifying traits is their seemingly singular, unstoppable focus in battle, silently marching forward with no emotion, no apparent care for any consequences, even for themselves. They just dominate, with a weight of presence few others are able to match. Their foes are cut to pieces as they sweep through like a righteous tsunami of vengeance, and almost always seem to turn the tide of battle into a glorious victory. On occasion, their actions can even be seen as preventing the Imperium itself from sliding into an unpreventable catastrophe. The Legion of the Damned are not merely lost warriors who appear at random. They do not seem to commonly also appear at the behest of others, but on occasion prayer may seem to summon them, but whether or not this is an actual call or just a coincidence is another matter. They're presumed to choose their engagements, their appearances are few and far between, and could be suggestive that they or whatever controls their arrival has some higher sense in selecting the importance of events they interject themselves into. But don't worry, we will get into all this later when we discuss about their origins and what their purpose is. But they do still seem to bear some connection to the physical realm. For example, these rarely sighted Astartes are still observed to wear power armor, although if this is in fact true armor or merely just a spiritual manifestation is open to interpretation. Their ceramite always appears of deepest black, even said to absorb light around it, and is adorned with iconography resembling the most macabre aspects of the Imperium: skulls, lots of skulls, or just skeletons, bones encasing around their weapons and so on. Their bodies wreathed in flames of the immaterium, or perhaps the purgatory within which they exist. No one truly knows the significance of the ethereal fire they observed to be enveloped by. Some eyewitnesses have suggested they were able to see the Marine's flesh even in a state of decay, but as to how reliable such accounts are, again, remains relatively unknown. Despite their appearance still seeming relatively corporeal, they are in fact anything but. But for those who pay more than casual attention, Xenos energy weapons and power blades may not even find resistance upon their armor. Likewise, beams and plasma volleys can pass right through them without causing even glancing harm. They have even been seen to take damage from heavy support weaponry and just shrug it off. Now, of course, sometimes the deadly weapons of M41 do find their mark, but as to what governs the rules and parameters as to when or why that occurs, that's another matter. Even when an enemy weapon makes contact and inflicts horrific damage, it appears to not phase or slow the Legionnaires in the slightest. They remain an unstoppable force, marching forward, 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 their bolter shots igniting the air, other weapons blazing lances of energy as they bear down upon their foe. For any who have not fled the field, they will soon be burned to ashes as the Legionnaires open up with the purifying flamers, heavy flamers, melters, multi-melters, incinerating with efficiency any who might dare to cower from the sudden shock assault, those others merely stunned by the sudden change of fortune and the appearance of these entities. But all is irrelevant for the Legion of the Damned. They never show mercy, pause, or consideration for an enemy to be armed, unarmed, standing ground, fleeing. All are simply torn to shreds, with expertly placed mass reactive bolts, slashing, masterfully wielded blade weapons, and the roar of chainswords bisecting enemies from head to groin. As the Legion vanish into the ether, the only trace they leave behind them is a bloody wake of shock, awe, carnage, and righteous fury. Examination of starship debris recovered in the Maran subsector does suggest a link between the Legion of the Damned and the fate of the Firehawks chapter. and the Firehawks were declared lost in the warp in 983 M41, 20 years after the entire chapter set out for Crow's World on a counter-invasion mission against a Xenos threat. But the Inquisition are unsurprisingly rather keen to discover if, in fact, the Legion of the Damned and the Firehawks are in fact one and the same chapter. If so, how is it that they gained their mysterious and deadly abilities? Why do they never communicate? Why did their appearance change? However, later contradictory accounts have potentially suggested that the Firehawks were in fact not completely destroyed, and that some remain active, albeit seemingly out of the radar of established channels. And this continues to add to the mysterious confusion around the Legion of the Damned. And one aspect of the Legion's involvement with the Imperium only became evident over time, that is, their appearance as saviours for the most loyal Imperial servants, often follow Astartes, but initially when they began to appear it was not clear really who or what they were, or their intentions, or who they were sided with. They usually appear at a time only when all other hope is lost, and they can be deemed as a blessing to be sure. Many may see them as saviours, undoubtedly, but beyond allowing a sanctioned objective to be completed, it's not still always immediately apparent why the Legion chose a specific instance to appear. Sometimes, of course, the benefit appears immediately clear, say the saving of a relic, the protection of a critical bastion for humanity. At other times, though, it has taken centuries before their reasoning becomes clearer, where an engagement they appear in has repercussions far down the line and far outside of any standard or reasonable range of prediction. This is only heightened the attention placed upon their appearances, as their actions demonstrate at least some ability to exert a sense of foresight in choosing their battles, that is to say either they or whoever they act at the behest of. So for this and additional far more obvious reasons, the Inquisition takes a keen interest in any reports of the Legion's appearance. Such events will be heavily documented, all involved interrogated, and the results and possible outcomes pored over at length by members of the Inquisition and their administrative analysts and psychers. This has, of course, only become more desperate as time goes on, and the Inquisition very urgently wishes to establish the agenda of the Legion of the Damned, plus of course any additional information. One of the most pressing would be who, if anyone, is choosing their engagements, and to what end. The Chaos Gods, after all, do not always operate with immediately clear consequences. In fact, the forces of chaos may sometimes set up masterfully complex plans that at face value may appear beneficial even to the Imperium, but eventually collapse in spectacularly devastating fashion like a heretical house of cards. For Inquisitors though, establishing information and facts about the Legion is easier said than done. For one, Legion often disappear as soon as they would appear. They also appear completely without any pattern, making predicting their next appearance near to impossible. And then there's the standard inquisitorial and imperial need for information about such unusual and unverified occurrences to be kept on a strictly need-to-know basis, so they cannot simply put out an all-chapters call to keep your eyes peeled. Although of course the myth of the Legion has become relatively established between Astartes chapters, after all nothing strictly heretical has taken place due to the involvement of the Legion of the Damned, and if anything it's always been beneficial. Some placing their faith that they act on behalf of the Emperor himself. Certainly this is the conclusion that any member of the ecclesiarchy could be likely to draw. Nonetheless, it remains the goal of the Inquisition to speak to these silent warriors and, if possible, detain one of them. But if that were to ever happen, just how beneficial it would be is very debatable. They very rarely speak, often only uttering a few phrases, and there's only one known instance where they engaged for a longer period of time. One of the most bizarre aspects of the Legion's appearance, though, is its effect on first-hand witnesses. In addition to any devices such as servo skulls that may have been able to collect some evidence of a Legion manifestation, their machine spirits are often reported to be, for whatever reason, badly traumatized, and to become operational at all again need to be coaxed back into life by an especially attentive member of the Mechanicus before they may yield any recording of the prior event, if at all. The most strange though is that with any mortal human witnesses, the sighting of the Legion, which might otherwise seem such a significant event that you would never forget it, has been observed to fairly quickly fade from people's memory. If a member of the Inquisition or other investigator wishes to obtain any kind of first-hand account, they must visit those who witnessed the incident within solar days, preferably hours, before the incident becomes little more than a blurred, vague dream or nightmare. Its presence in the mind only held for longer by the strength of the individual, meaning thankfully Astartes tend to be a little bit more of a reliable source of information. However, some lingering triggers will remain with witnesses for weeks, years, or even the rest of a life, leaving those who bore witness to the Legion of the Damned with disturbed thoughts, troubled sleep, and blurred memories that seem to be just out of reach, as if something you only forgot a moment ago, but which is now totally beyond reach, and that can never quite be traced back to the source. One of the core reasons that the Inquisition and very likely others such as the Navigators are eager to capture to then study or learn from the Legion of the Damned is their ability by which they appear always at this critical time and always in the most advantageous place to bring death to the enemy. To harness the abilities of the Legion of the Damned promises the power once held by the Eldar, except even greater. The Eldar, when their webway was in its period of zenith, were able to travel the entire galaxy at speed and could appear almost anywhere with vast armies. This was one of the factors that enabled them to defeat the Necron tier, and they were of course an immensely powerful race at that time. But now the webway lays broken, collapsed in places, shut off in others, and the Eldar can no longer use it very reliably. They know the key routes that are essential to them, but it is nothing compared to how it was used millions of years before. Obviously, for the Imperium, travelling through the warp is absolutely terrifying, albeit unfortunately necessary. Now we might take it at face value that, the Imperium travel through the warp. It's by far and away not something they would choose if there were any other option. If there were literally any other means of travelling the galaxy, humanity would likely take it. It will in fact be very interesting to see if the Tau, for example, ever learn of some more efficient means of travel faster than light. Such an event could in fact be game-changing for the burgeoning race of Comic Sans using Gundam pilots. Hey, I said it might be a good thing for the Tau. So for humanity, the prospect of finding some means of negotiating the warp reliably and accurately is something of a holy grail for the leaders of the Imperium. It's the kind of thing that, were it looking reasonably achievable, almost no expense or effort would be spared to secure such a powerful advancement. It wouldn't be too strong to say that it would very likely change the strength of humanity at a galactic level. Some might suggest to make the Imperium in fact undefeatable, unstoppable. As things stand currently, forces have to be divided throughout the galaxy. Entire planets must retain massive standing armies to prevent the possible threats posed by Xenos, heretics and other. However, this is generally only necessary because of the massive amount of time and logistics in moving Imperial forces from one place to another. It's why Astartes chapters are spread throughout the galaxy, some fleet-based, instead of being merely in core sectors of the galaxy. Because the Imperium distributes its forces very thinly, but builds them up in the most dangerous of areas, those which border Xenos territory, the Great Rift and so on. But if you could only unlock an ability to move your forces almost instantaneously across the galaxy, it's almost beyond comprehension as to how much that would multiply the power of the Imperium. Instead of a single Astartes chapter taking on a major battle, you could bring 10, 20, 30, throw in some Sororitas, some Imperial Guard, why not several Titan legions for good measures? It would obviously be an insanely powerful advantage both tactically and in terms of the literal weight of military power that could be deployed. So it's no wonder that a significant interest is taken in the Legion of the Damned by the Inquisition, simply for how they are able to appear. Still, something being interesting is one thing, but achieving anything practical relative to it is another. One other mysterious reaction seems to occur around the Legion of the Damned, and that is whenever an Imperial servant, be they a citizen, Astartes or Inquisitor, come close to securing any real information about the Legion of the Damned by direct interaction, something conveniently gets in the way. That is to say, events of fate seem to keep them apart. Random seismic events, telekinetic bursts, sudden mass aneurysms, even vehicular explosions force the curious and the mysterious apart until the Legion has vanished once more. It's understandable that the Legion would not wish for itself to be interrogated, but strangely it's as if they, or more likely something else, contains the power or will to ensure that such an event never takes place. But of course there are exceptions, which seems to suggest perhaps they have a level of control. But I must admit, this specific oddity is one of those things about the Legion of the Damned that makes me want to go off on a lengthy tangent about time and conflicts therein, perhaps some physics. One reality attempting to engage with another, mysterious forces invisibly wanting to prevent it. Reminds me very much of something I've spoken about before, that time travel series called 11/22/63. In the show, any attempt to change the past causes not individuals but events, essentially reality itself, to react with more and more dramatic and aggressive situations. It's an interesting concept, and very briefly the idea is something along the lines that, as I've noted before, while the jury is out on how set the future might be, the past is something that, despite what movies would want you to believe, is set. It's happened, so you can't go back and change it. It has already taken place, and things continue always to move forward. In 112263, this plays with that idea that the past is actually structured by laws. You can visit it and go there, but just like we have laws for physics, the past can accommodate and tolerate some presence in it. But if you try to change it too much, the very fabric of reality will resist you, because you cannot change what is solid and established. The consequences for anyone who attempts to distort the established order are seemingly lethal. There are of course other narratives that play with this idea of time and reality overlapping when they shouldn't, and it causing unforeseen consequences like somebody slipping into a coma in the movie Primer. So I actually think it's very reasonable that something as mysterious and ethereal as the Legion of the Damned may in fact be very difficult to interact with. I mean, they can literally be shot at with heavy support scale weapons and blink it off. One can imagine an Inquisitor attempting to capture a Legion of the Damned, and upon touching their armour is just consumed by ethereal flame, leaving nothing but a small pile of ash where they stood. Or they fall into a massive seizure and a permanent coma, or perhaps as suggested, any attempt to interact with them causes some nearby physical disaster blocking a path to them. You get the idea. But like I say, there are exceptions, there are noted exceptions which we'll come to shortly, but this lack of certainty surrounding the Legion of the Damned retains this air of mystery, fear, and their dominating, awe-inspiring presence that leaves loyal Imperial servants stunned and the enemies of humanity slaughtered. In terms of what we can say with relative certainty about the Legion of the Damned, it's a fairly short list of common themes. However, if you delve into the lore proper, some of the assumed specifics are not commonly correct. This is, as always to a degree, dependent on how you wish to view the first and second-hand Imperial reports of others, getting back into the diegesis idea. Now firstly is their skill. This one is basically true. Legion of the Damned are commonly, by every account, observed to be at a master level in their skills, which is fine. One thing though, and this tends to actually be a wider issue as well, is when it's being discussed about how skillful someone is or a faction is, how exactly is that gauged? Especially if it's being noted by other already very skillful Astartes. Because Astartes are already meant to be the zenith of human warriors, so when they describe other Marines as being masterful, where's the benchmark there? If they can kill other Astartes with ease, are they Primarch level, Custodes, Grey Knights? It's fair to say that the Legion of the Damned are just very good with weapons. But perhaps an actual count is maybe a better example. So when the forces of traitor World Eaters were assaulting a cemetery world, a Legion of the Damned Astartes approached a blood-drenched son of Angron with great speed and in total silence. So much so that it was only as the traitor finally turned in a fraction of a second was he then able to realise something was upon him, but far too late. A blade held by the Legionnaire was already at his throat, and with a single solid deliberate motion, the Legionnaire cut cleanly through his neck armour, through the flesh, right to the bone. The World Eater fell dead to the floor, crimson ocean pouring from his neck. The Legion of the Damned Astartes was already gone, no comment, no pause, no hesitation, on to the next traitor. Permanent silence. This one is only partially true. Most often Legion of the Damned are described as being absolutely silent ethereal warriors. They're noted for fighting in silence, although silence merely means they just don't run across a battlefield shouting, "For the Emperor!" or "Count the 7!" and all that jazz. However, this concept that the Legion of the Damned are completely silent at all times is not completely correct. While the ordinary Space Marines of the Legion of the Damned appear to speak very infrequently, they have been known to speak to ordinary mortals, albeit usually very briefly, and often as they're about to end someone, saying something like, "For the Emperor," or "Only in death." The most significant exception is of course Brother Sergeant Centurius. He appears to be the designated spokesperson for the Legion of the Damned and is the only one who has held extended conversations. More on that shortly. But basically, do the Legion of the Damned exist in a permanent state of silence? No. Always appearing when the Imperium needs. Now this one is accurate. As already discussed, the Legion of the Damned have a habit of appearing not just in urgent times but moments that are pivotal. It suggests that they can foresee what actions will have a significant or otherwise longer-term impact for the Imperium. Is this psychic foresight? Is it that they reside in a realm which enables them to see moments of criticality, or is it that whatever or whoever is commanding them holds the power of foresight? Unknown, but we can say with certainty that they always appear at these dire moments. What is less certain is how they appear. They're sometimes said to phase into reality like ethereal ghosts appearing out of nowhere. Other times they've been reported as specifically visually teleporting in. Now, that could be attributed to an individual under pressure mistaking one for the other, but I should note that in the only ever existing codex for the Legion of the Damned, a quoted reference notes, "The air around the bridge grew hot. A moment later, a squad of heavily armed space marines manifested via teleport, which was theoretically impossible, for Inquisitor Mergus had already ascertained the presence of a translocation scrambler field. The Astartes were clad in black power armour, adorned with images of skulls, ribcages, hands, and sundry other bones. As soon as they appeared, they opened fire upon the Eldar with an impressive array of flamer weaponry. I noted that the distinctive smell of petrochemicals, indeed of any combustible fuel, was entirely absent. The flames were nonetheless effective, and many of the Xenos command staff were reduced to ash." After this encounter, the Legion of the Damned shimmer out of vision, so exactly how they appear is still up in the air. It could also be that they use something beyond the standard teleportation, maybe even a Xenos device, some technology that enables them to translocate, but that merely looks like teleportation. Alternatively, given everything about their nature, it may just be more warp curiosity. But like so many details about the Legion, it's really anybody's best guess until we know otherwise. Another myth that can be dispelled is the idea the Legion of the Damned appear, fight, and then immediately vanish. While this is true often enough, there are known exceptions where they will not only wait around post-battle, but even have a representative engage with the mortals they appeared in order to save. One thing that is generally observably true about the Legion of the Damned is that they do not appear to commonly use physical hardware like tanks, speeders, ships, drop pods. They almost always seem to appear as infantry only. They have been seen to use some kind of space vessel which appeared to be Imperial in origin, but also was very much like a ghost ship, much as they themselves, wrapped by ethereal flame dancing over it, which helps again to support the idea that they are remnants of a destroyed legion or chapter, and could also help to explain why they have no heavy support material to bring to the field of battle. Alternatively, perhaps in their state of being, they are merely unable to utilise such tools. What they do appear to utilise are flamer weapons and energy weapons, including plasma. However, as has been observed, despite their appearance, just like all aspects of the Legion of the Damned, these appear to be visually representative only and not based in any physical material. They do not use fuel or energy in firing those weapons, pointing again to them being psychic in nature, i.e. of the immaterial realm, the warp. Lastly, it would be true to say that they appear almost always anonymous. No name is given or spoken for any of the Legion of the Damned, save of course for that one individual whose name was only discovered and associated by chance. Brother Sergeant Atticus Centurius is believed to be a veteran sergeant of the honoured First Company of the Legion of the Damned, or possibly whatever preceded them. He is identified most by carrying the Animus Malorum, an ancient relic in the shape of a skull that can drain the souls of mortal targets and use that power to resurrect and empower fellow Legion of the Damned who have fallen in battle, bolstering their numbers. It's also been seen to tear the soul from loyal individual Astartes, allowing them to become members of the Legion of the Damned. While all the Legion of the Damned are seemingly anonymous, as we said, one individual did appear among them, this Brother Sergeant Atticus Centurius. Why he appears to speak on behalf of the Legion is unclear, but he has on several occasions engaged with mortal humans and has also shed light on the Legion itself. In the story Legion of the Damned, a neophyte discovers an Astartes coffin in the craters of the cemetery world Sirtis Minor. The one he opens has a plaque describing Brother Sergeant Atticus Centurius, honoured First Company, in dedicato imperatum ultra articulo mortis, for the Emperor beyond the point of death. This additionally complicates matters related to the origin theories of the Legion of the Damned, not to mention when Atticus appears in the story Animus Malorum, heads up spoilers for the rest of this segment. So after the Legion of the Damned save a group of Marines and humans on a planet, as is often the case, they're faced with these spectral warriors. But they don't immediately depart. In fact, this is where they're first seen to hold the relic known as the Animus Malorum, that Centurius carries seemingly everywhere thereafter. The Legion explains that this item is one of their most sacred relics, and that the Xenos assault upon them could have led to its destruction, hence their appearance. Centurius explains that the Astartes' courage and honour were never in any doubt, but he also explains that there is a rising tally, a debt that must be paid in souls. This helps us to understand a common misconception with the Legion. It's often presumed that they are acting as martyrs out of some sense of shame or to set right their honour. Much like during the heresy and in its aftermath, some lost Astartes who remained loyal from traitor legions felt compelled to go on these crusades of penance, effectively black shields, or how some planets such as Krieg and Vostroya carry with them seemingly now permanent debts owed to the Imperium. There are many other such examples of planets, chapters, peoples who sided against the Imperium and failed in their duty and then later set out to right the wrong. So it's reasonable as to why people would presume this is to be true of the Legion of the Damned. It makes sense. Lost chapter, fails, must repent for its shambolic performance in the eyes of the Emperor. Tale as old as time. Except that might be an oversimplification. There may be some truth in there, but as Centurius makes clear, the Legion of the Damned do not seem to be acting out of a purely penitent motivation, nor do they seemingly seek to be martyrs. I mean, they're dead already, and also, to be a martyr, it needs to be explicitly clear why you died for a specific reason, what your agenda, what your ideology was, and it often helps to have a name if you want to be a martyr. So they really don't fit that mould, it doesn't really make sense. So when Centurius speaks of miracles coming at a cost and a rising tally, it's concerning, troubling even, especially for the Astartes to which he is directing that conversation. The debt incurred, though, does seem to be on the part of the Imperium rather than individuals who are saved by the Legion, and to pay the debt, it must be paid to the Legion in souls. Essentially, the Legion of the Damned act out of their services to aid and save these critical moments for the Imperium, but although spectral, they're not immune to weapons of the material realm. It's true that sometimes weapons pass directly through them, but this seems for whatever reason to be not a permanent state of immunity. They seem to phase in and out of reality, and sometimes they'll certainly take damage and can fall in battle because of it. Unlike ordinary Astartes though, the Legion are unable to replenish their numbers by ordinary means. They can't obviously grow and develop new Legion of the Damned. So this Animus Malorum is what Centurius uses. He uses it to take souls of Imperials, Astartes, and bolster the ethereal forces of the Legion of the Damned. Seemingly though, again, there are exceptions, and this is where we see the brother captain of the Astartes in this story told by Centurius that he is to be recruited by the Legion, something no one imagined until then was possible. It also certainly pokes a hole through some theories about the Legion and their origins and what they are. Centurius states to the captain that, "We would have you, Captain Ereses. We would claim you as a worthy member of the Legion. You are ready to give your life in defense of this world, and even in death to deny it from the foe. From the bones of your noble kind were the foundations of the Imperium once built. Where you lead, others follow without question. As a martyr, you would be wasted. As a legionnaire, you will be eternal." But this appears not to be the case for the rest of the Astartes who survived that instance. They are seemingly condemned by the Centurius, and this is notable because it definitely supports the idea, as some suggest, that the Legion of the Damned are not entirely the saviours they're often presented to be. The Tech Marine there realises their impending demise and attempts to argue with Centurius. "Ereses did not speak for all of us in this," and Centurius seems to consider that for a moment before unsheathing his chainsword. "Your captain would have given his life selflessly and unconditionally in the service of the Emperor. But your sacrifice was hollow, expected, commanded. For that, your soul is forfeit. The debt is too great, and the tally is rising. With each passing decade, it is rising." A cold numbness crept into the fingers of the Tech Marine. His pistol fell from his grip. He could hear nothing but his brother's death agonies over the Vox link before crackling into a frightful silence. "Not for you, the immortal servitude of the Legion. You will pay what is owed." The Inquisition have continually attempted to record all known instances whereby the Legion of the Damned appeared. For if they are ever to achieve their goal of working with or gaining some useful technical information about them, then the first step would seem to be cataloguing their appearances and trying to understand what can be discerned from such engagements. Unfortunately, it tends to provide few answers or data which could help formulate a plan of action. If anything, it only serves to underscore the seemingly random nature as to their appearances, not helped by the fact that they seem to occur right across the galaxy. So establishing a permanent research team in one area would not be beneficial either. Many incidents involving the Legion of the Damned are merely recorded for the sake of record keeping. I've chosen a few that have potentially more significant benefits and are illustrative of the deeper implications of the Legion's actions. After forces of chaos assault an adamantium mining operation and the Militarum forces crushed, strange marines are said to begin appearing and pushing back against the tide of demons, in what would become known as the Pyrocataclysm after these mysterious Astartes were in fact pushed back upon by a massive demon force. Those who turned into literal infernos demonstrated that the fire of the Legionnaires was able to burn even demon flesh, and the Slaneshi entities were sent screaming back to their foul realm. During the fighting, a dozen new seams of adamantium were revealed by weapon blast that scarred the surface of Villadad Prime. The nearby forge world of Lepitu Anvil tripled its production of war material, ensuring the majority of its labourers benefited the chapters of the Adeptus Astartes. When Hive Fleet Moloch invaded the Imperial weapon testing planet of Godba, the Tyranids found that the world had a vicious bite of its own. Everything from unclassified super heavy war engines to Gatling macro cannon were employed by the tech priest Engiseers that supervised the planet's defence, with entire phalanxes of Baneblades and Shadow Swords leading the charge against the invaders. Unfortunately, it was not enough, and when things began to look hopeless and a final crew of the last remaining Shadow Swords emerged stunned to see squad after squad of Space Marines forming a cordon around their tanks, the relentless pounding of their bolters and billowing flames of their heavy weapons blasting back the gaunts of the Tyranid. The arrival of more super heavy tanks and almost 100 reported Legionnaires tipped fate in the favour of the Imperium. The invading swarm was shattered, dispersed, and eventually exterminated in the system. One of the most important appearances of the Legion of the Damned involved Chief Librarian Tigurius, who had led an Ultramarines strike force to rescue a delegation of tech priests from the Orc invasion of the world of Andraxis. Upon the world and inside its great bastion, the Mechanicus had unearthed the Psyker staff with recognition codes of the Sigillite. Recovery of the object was paramount. Unfortunately, the planet was already overrun, and so the Orcs poured down upon the bastion in impossible numbers. All was seen to be lost, except that at dawn of what looked like to be their last days serving the Emperor, the Legion of the Damned burst into real space. The slaughter was immense, and the Orcs were scattered. The bastion was secured, and the staff recovered. It would, upon further study, reveal important details about the Golden Throne's construction and enabled a greater understanding of the sacrifice made in the name of the Imperium. It is still believed to be held by the Chief Librarian. It should be noted that Tigurius appears to have reported this event with the Legion of the Damned as occurring in 967 M41, yet it is also recorded as occurring in 922 M41. As I always like to remind, within the Imperium things are often very incorrectly archived. Why remains unclear, unless of course there is some other unexplained untoward issue here. The report given was at the behest of a minor order of the Inquisition known as Obsoletus. This is in fact the only known mention of them and one Inquisitor Darius. Were they destroyed, merged with another ordo? Nothing more is spoken or known of them. But the Chief Librarian's report to the Inquisitor was as follows. An hour before dawn, I called the company to prayer, and since our chaplain was slain, we made our peace with the Emperor in battle fashion. It was as I raised my eyes from prayer that I saw a strange host where moments before there was nothing but darkness. At first I thought it was some connivance of the Orcs, but as the host advanced I realised it was of Space Marines, though not of any chapter under the Emperor's son. Their armour was coloured black, and upon it were chilling images of bones and fire, and on their helms they bore skulls. As they advanced, an eerie glow shrouded them, and fire seemed to dance about their feet, like the bones of men in the torment of purgatory they were, so that they looked more like skeletons than living men, yet not a sound did they make. For a while, I believed this to be some phantasm, a vision of ancient times, but I had heard the Emperor grant such sights to those of his warriors who faced death in his name. But it was not so, for soon the ghostly warriors reached the orcs' battle line, and suddenly the air was full of battle din, and the orcs were wailing and crying in their terror. We that remained watched the Dark Battle Brothers at their work, and never before since have I seen fighting such as I witnessed that dawn. Seizing the moment, I regrouped my company and we led them to war. Yet there was little work left for us. The orcs lacked the stomach for the fight. Soon we secured the Great Bastion once more, and without further loss. Of the Dark Brotherhood, there was no sign. And then, in what I must say is yet another footnote to add to the embarrassing litany of instances whereby the Imperial Fists are nearly destroyed, comes the story of the Phalanx, the monastic supervessel used by the chapter as their space monastery. While orbiting Terra, their old friends the Iron Warriors poured out from the warp. Battle erupted as the newly forged Imperial Fist's third company fought to repel all borders, but of course they sadly failed to halt the onslaught of the Demon Prince Be'lakor. The Iron Warriors then sought to turn the immense power of the orbital weapon systems aboard the ship to engage the Imperial Palace upon Terra, which would have been appalling. But without Astartes enough to stop them, the Imperial Fists made an emergency translation into the warp. Things were now looking very desperate. Yet when the Imperial Fists had shown that they were incapable of defending their own fortress monastery, finally a spectral fire swept through the lower decks, burning back the demonic horrors, and out of the fire walked an entire army of the Legion of the Damned, who set to work showing the Imperial Fists precisely how it should be done, exterminating any demons that were encountered. The Imperial Fists finally were spurred to launch their own counterattack upon the Iron Warriors' forces and eventually cleared the vessel of the traitors. Now, as noted earlier, this is one of the instances where the Legion would remain after the battle. They would stay aboard the Phalanx to hold the hands of the Imperial Fists as the huge ship travelled to aid the defenders of Cadia from the emerging 13th Black Crusade. The Legion would then appear on the Blackstone Fortress also to aid the Space Wolves, destroying a power interchanger and allowing the Phalanx to disable the Blackstone Fortress. Unfortunately, we all know the end to that story, and the Blackstone Fortress is thrown into Cadia. The planet is shockingly destroyed. This marks one of the instances where the Legion of the Damned, despite their best efforts, were unable to avoid a catastrophic disaster for the Imperium. Now we get to the meat of things, because speculation as to the Legion's true nature runs rampant amongst the cognoscenti of the Imperium. Ideas range from scholars suggesting that the Legion of the Damned are some kind of psychic backlash made real, to them being broken individuals just twisted by the warp. Events such as the Istvan massacres or the death of a Primarch were so traumatic that it's believed they left a psychic permanent scar on the psyche of all the legions. Some question whether events such as these in fact had some far greater impact than anybody could have imagined, and that it were these events, the trauma of the heresy itself, that caused the creation of the Legion of the Damned. Among some Astartes chapters, they've come to believe a form of this story, that the pain and the rage felt by many Marines down through subsequent foundings has led to some kind of collective agony to be then subconsciously manifested by the Astartes psykers into the warp. Others suggest that it is not the Astartes alone, but a wider power of hope that throughout all of humanity comes together to empower and form the Legion of the Damned. Similarly perhaps to the Eldar in their most ancient of times, when collective thought was powerful enough it could build and create entities from the warp itself. This would in effect make the Legion of the Damned demons of a kind. The Astartes have come to represent hope and the righteous fury of the Emperor. So within that idea is the theory that the trillions of humans that populate the Imperium all contribute to some kind of psychic reservoir that can then be tapped into. This is used by, for example, the Sororitas, but also by other entities who are made manifest. The most common theory regarding the Legion of the Damned is that they are in fact the remnants of the former Firehawks chapter of Astartes, an Ultramarines successor. who disappeared never to be seen again after being sent to deal with some Xenos. But there is of course more to them than that, which we will get into. In temperament, the Firehawks were notoriously bellicose, their battle tactics almost entirely concerned with the application of overwhelming force to bring about the total and immediate destruction of an enemy. But they were not mindless berserkers, not world eaters, and never threw away their own lives in the pursuit of impossible objects. In fact, this in itself caused them some issues. They would often turn away from battles they were greatly needed in if they deemed the overall outcome to be too costly, and this apathy also left them with a somewhat tarnished reputation for being too blunt and cold toward others. Some loyal members of the Imperium disapproved of their methodology, so much so that they were in fact coming close to calling them out as being traitorous, especially in their attitude whereby they simply refused to sacrifice themselves for anything but the highest of causes, and when they committed themselves to battle, the result was the total destruction of any who stood before them, whether or not that was a good idea. Also, the Firehawks, unlike most Space Marine chapters, were very notably strict adherents of the Imperial cult, believing in the Emperor's divinity and humanity's manifest destiny to dominate the galaxy. For example, in the early 36th millennium, such was the fervour of their faith that they became deeply involved in the wars of the Age of Apostasy, whereas many other chapters preferred to stay on the sidelines in this vicious religious civil war of the Imperium, paying in blood for their convictions in support of the Thorian reformers of the Confederation of Light against the unreformed ecclesiarchy. The Firehawks were also very firm believers in the Imperium of man's established status quo. They took a singular interest in the destruction of renegade Imperial commanders, apostate cardinals, and other wayward Imperial lords, regularly consigning entire cities and colony worlds to fire in order to achieve their aims. And the chapter has often been held in higher regard among the High Lords of Terror and their agents than many of its other wartime allies, especially among Astartes. Because of this, it is known to be the case that several other Space Marine chapters considered the Firehawks darkly tainted. They believe them to be in some as yet unseen way corrupted. It's due to these flaws that some speculate that if they are in fact the Legion of the Damned, their aim is to remedy these flawed methods with their penance. One thing I will say is that some people do seem to feel very strongly about the Firehawks theory, but I just want to remind us always that like anything in 40k, these details are not a set in stone, unequivocal position, but this one is actually pretty strong compared to other ideas. Ideas which, while arguably more interesting, do not seem to have the same weight of evidence behind it. It's true enough that some of the other core speculations about the Legion of the Damned point to them being warp-based in their origin, but it's also true that they still seem very tethered to reality also. In the story titled Legion of the Damned, a neophyte discovers Astartes' coffins upon the cemetery world of Sirtis Minor, including one who is a named member of the Legion of the Damned, the aforementioned Centurius. Swinging open, the lid bounced on its chunky hinge, presenting a dark interior, an empty interior. Looking deep inside, Omar found nothing. No remains of the Adeptus Astartes battle brother he expected to find within. On the inside of the lid, the scout discovered a simple plaque identifying a gene code in symbol and number, a name, rank, and company dictum. Brother Sergeant Atticus Centurius, Honoured First Company, in dedicato imperatum ultra articulo mortis, for the Emperor beyond the point of death. Now, the interesting thing about that inscription is that this is the same motto found on the chapter banner of the Firehawks, as seen upon their ruined banner recovered in 988 M41. Now that seems a pretty open-shut situation, but it's not entirely necessarily conclusive evidence, because we do know the scenario surrounding Centurius as well. We already know that the Legion are able to bring individual Astartes of good character into their own via the Animus Malorum. There's nothing to say that the Sergeant Centurius were not merely an individual subjected to the same practice. There are those who believe the Firehawks underwent some kind of strange metamorphosis after their disappearance, that they became irreversibly changed by the tides of the warp, both dying and somehow remaining alive. Knowing that they could never openly serve the Imperium in their warp-tainted state, they became the Legion of the Damned, fighting on in the Emperor's name from the hell that had become their home, using the souls of others to prop up their losses and considering it a necessary tally under the Emperor's holy name. It's always tempting in a verse as complex and myriad as that of 40k to go off on wild and complex explanations for the events and individuals who make up the history of the Imperium. It should be noted though that as much as this is enjoyable, sometimes it's just true that the simplest theory is more likely to be correct, and in this case, as to the Legion's nature, this straightforward explanation does seem the most credible. That the Firehawks were lost in the warp, consumed, damaged, altered in some way, and now they remain as spiritual echoes of once great Space Marines, whose religious passion and burning hatred for the enemies of the Imperium was so powerful that it transcended mortal limits and became expressed in their very physical being, now in an eternal state. It may also mean that the Firehawks were merely the beginning of what became the Legion of the Damned. It's possible that others like them have died and been resurrected as members of the Legion of the Damned, or that they found their way to them on the ethereal plane. The few reports of those who have seen the Legion of the Damned unhelmed speak of ghostly pallor, sunken skin, hollow eye sockets, skulls, unsurprisingly. Every supernatural occurrence, every glitch in reality that is attributed to the mysterious warriors also adds credence to theories about them. Perhaps those who know of their existence prefer to imagine these spectral space marines as revenants, for what mortal mind could possibly stand a life bound to the hell dimension of the warp and still remain sane. We also learned more from a data recorder that was shipped back to Terra after the Legion of the Damned saved a research station from an Orc attack, and this secretly revealed to the Administratum the truth of what had happened to the Firehawks after they had made their fateful journey into the warp. Following their jump, the entire fleet had been caught within a warp storm of terrific intensity. Stunned by the power of the warp, the chapter was forced to endure the attacks of powerful warp entities. Ship after ship was destroyed and quite literally absorbed into the fabric of the Immaterium. Eventually only a single craft remained. With nothing left to lose at this point, not dissimilar to the crew of the Eisenstein, the craft burst out of warp space, finding itself in the far east of the galaxy, many thousands of light years of course beyond the psychic light of the Astronomicon. Only 200 Firehawks remained, and they were badly injured. All of the chapter's gene seed had been lost in the warp. All other elements, including officers, initiates and serfs, had been lost as well. In the coming months, their exposure to the warp unshielded caused them to become decayed, blackened in their skin. All were suffering in abject agony. They slowly began to die. Whatever they had been exposed to was so severe that by the time they found their way back to Imperial space, another half of those Marines that survived were already dead. But then we come to this part which really makes little sense. Any who remained were said to be in so much pain and broken by this ordeal and through their suffering that they lost all their sanity. And then, that they became the Legion of the Damned. Yes, that's right, despite being insane, having barely survived, they all decided, you know what, we're going to become the Legion of the Damned. And they changed their armour out, they painted it up, they put skulls over everything, and that's it, sorted. Now if that sounds kind of clumsy, nonsensical and crowbarred in, it's because it does sound like that. Because this last section to explain the Firehawks' demise is pretty old lore. And it sort of ends up being hammered in like a jigsaw puzzle piece that really looks like it should fit, but it's not the right piece. But you don't seem to have another one, so you just kind of smash it into place. And this issue, this glaring bizarrity, could be very easily fixed up with a small update somewhere in a story, a small adjacent little story, a fragment of data somewhere found on a ship, a relic, an encounter. Anything like that really could help tidy this up regarding the Firehawks. So yes, if you want to lean in on the Firehawk theory, it's fine, but you just have to accept that the end of the story is basically, and then they decided to be the Legion of the Damned, which for me is awful. Despite all of the encumbering issues they were having, half of them dying, they're in this terrible state of affairs, they're just destroyed. They just make this huge decision and then go back into the warp, and everything was fine? There's no explanation, and that's the big question mark. It's why personally I find the Firehawks theory pretty unpalatable, because despite all the glaring, apparently documented evidence, the piece that breaks it is the last piece, this most credible, most critical piece. It's just really broken, it doesn't make sense, and I can't really abide by it. This next theory is a very common speculation, but I feel it's also a significantly overthought analysis. It's based on the fact that in Master of Mankind, the Emperor summons forth a presumed proto-Legion of the Damned, made up of the betrayed dead of Istvan, not long after the situation had already occurred, as well as a headless giant that is sometimes speculated to being Ferrus Manus, the Primarch. Quote, "The Emperor raised his sword in a two-handed grip, his knuckles tightened. The geography of circuitry ignited along the blade's length, spitting electrical fire and wreathing the sword's length in flame. He didn't speak, he didn't look at any of his warriors. The sword came down. The webway caught fire. Shapes raged in the flames, shadows and suggestions doing battle with the demons, their fiery forms indistinct and ever-changing. The fire-born avatars of fallen 10,000, knee-deep in psychic fire and thrusting with lance of flame. The silhouettes of Space Marines, the betrayed dead of Istvan, bearing axes and blades and claws, half-seen sigils of slaughtered legions, obscured by the ash of their blackened armour. A giant among giants, its great hands bared and ready as it seared forwards at the crest of the tidal fire. The 10th son of a dying empire, so briefly reborn in his father's immolating wrath." Now, many people have speculated that these dead of Istvan go on to become the Legion of the Damned. One obvious answer would be that the Emperor used his power to call their souls to his aid before they were lost into the warp forever, a final act for them, only in death does duty end. In fact, one member of the Legion of the Damned even speaks that phrase out loud millennia from this time. Maybe the Emperor used more power than he meant to in summoning them, so that they were unwittingly infused with an excess of the Emperor's psychic power, and this enabled them to linger. And now they exist, trapped in something like a purgatory in between the material realm and the immaterium, the warp. If that were true, it would help explain how they're able to readily walk into reality and appear anywhere whenever it's necessary. It would also help explain how they're able to appear over many millennia, as something like ethereal spectres. I think that this could also pair readily with the tarot symbiosis, the idea that they're able to somehow tap into the immense psychic prescience of the Master of Mankind and through him see some moments of the future in the swirling tides of the warp. Now, one thing people might not be happy to learn is that in this idea about Ferrus Manus, Aaron Dembski-Bowden, author of Master of Mankind, has actually publicly said he doesn't believe that in this moment it was the spirit of Ferrus Manus who appeared. Although I have to say, it really sounds like it was. A giant 10th son, dying empire, reborn in his father's immolating wrath? I mean, who else is it going to be? Who? Another small thing of note, which is really superficial, but they are called the Legion of the Damned. And legions ceased to exist really post-heresy, so if they didn't originate from the heresy period, why would they be called the Legion and refer to themselves as legionnaires? As a matter of fact, why would the Firehawks suddenly start referring to themselves as legionnaires and the Legion? So I think for all those reasons, it adds a few weights on the scales of this argument. But this just also helps to illustrate the reasons as to why the Legion continued to be speculated on so heavily, because there are often clues to their origin. It's just that often the clues are pointing in all different directions, contradicting one another. Inquisitor Kios, before he was slain by Gregor Eisenhorn, speculated that it was humanity's omnipresent faith in the Emperor that formed this Dark Legion. In this sense, he posited that they were not dissimilar from the demonic minions of the Chaos Gods, and that just as they were shards of their masters, so too were the Legion of the Emperor. The Inquisitor also speculated that perhaps this could lead to the emergence of even greater, as yet unseen forms, similar to those greater demons of chaos, but of the Emperor. Their observable behaviour is somewhat supportive to this idea. The Legion are seemingly able to appear anywhere at any time, not using the webway, not using warp portals. They can literally appear out of thin air. Now that puts into play that purgatory between warp and reality idea, but it also could be that they are beings of the warp, as it is only those demons of chaos who can seemingly appear anywhere, anytime. But a key point is that demons usually are only able to appear if a Chaos God really exerts enough power, or they're otherwise summoned into existence, or by using some other thin gateway between the realms, or like a consumed psyker, warp tear, etc. Well, the Inquisitor did note that according to their record keeping, the Legion tended to appear in areas where the barrier between the warp and real space was said to be thin. It's always said that the Legion of the Damned appeared anywhere the Imperium required, but there is no real indication that that statement is anything more than a speculative mythology, wishful thinking as it were, by the faithful. Because if you believed hard enough in your hour of need, the Legion of the Damned will appear and save you. Except that's just not true, and if it were, there are certainly more parameters to their appearances than are immediately apparent. In terms of appearance, they're always wreathed in this ethereal fire. What do we think of when we think of things wrapped in ethereal flame? Well, one that is most prominently in mind is the Emperor's Sword. Another observable clue is that they always fight in silence. They're of course not the only ones to do so, and it should be noted that some Astartes chapters or Legion were known for fighting in silence as a psychological weapon, but still, it could point toward them again being more like projections of a greater power. The speculative idea here is that the Legion of the Damned are not ghosts or lost souls, as is sometimes believed, but they're in fact projections, extensions of the Emperor's psychic will. Within the Inquisition, some believe the Emperor to be trapped still in the throne, some believe he exists in a state between life and death, and some believe he's already transcended to the warp long ago, and that all which remains on Terra now is his physical form. The Golden Throne acts more as a gateway to siphon power to the Emperor in the warp, bolstered of course by his worship across the galaxy, fueling him kind of like a Chaos God. And that is of course entirely unsubstantiated. But it is a concept that is plausible and kicking around for some time now. I mean, I think it makes sense when you think of how many humans in the galaxy are worshipping the Emperor like a god. And with what we know of the warp, it's reasonable to assume that this could be very empowering. So in all of this speculation, it does have some grounding. It's certainly not implausible, but it does appear somewhat discredited by the fact that Centurius, again, is noted as having existed outside of the warp, not to mention these descriptions of how he recruits new souls for warriors within the Legion of the Damned. Still, that may not be, in and of itself, evidence of anything. Just because a box somewhere bears his name, it doesn't rule out other scenarios. It could simply mean that Centurius was chosen as some kind of named commander for these otherwise anonymous sentinels of the Emperor. His coffin could have been some kind of tribute. But this idea of them being psychic extensions of the Emperor, I think I can admit it's a more plausible theory. So, time shenanigans. Now, some of you are undoubtedly thinking, oh no, he said something about time again. Well, don't worry, we're keeping it simple today, and also I mentioned some of this earlier. So all I will note is that one theory stems from an Inquisitor of the Ordo Kronos who speculated that the Legion of the Damned were in fact echoes of an alternate future, sent back to steer the favour of mankind. However, and critically, they also added that they felt compelled to believe this as an alternative was too terrible to contemplate, which is pretty vague and doesn't really sound like it's supporting your argument very much. It plays well into my I hate time getting involved in fiction position, or more specifically, I hate when it's badly and lazily crowbarred into fiction, because once it's in, if not handled properly, it can just set fire to established narrative elements very quickly, which tends to happen in many big franchises. As far as I'm concerned, if you were asking me, the idea of alternate timelines is not a thing in 40k. It's bloody complicated enough already, and not just because I hate it, but also for the reasons I previously discussed on other videos. I do accept that it might be possible that Psykers, or like the Eldar and the Emperor, are able to see potential options for future pathways, but the key idea is that once it has occurred, it's locked in, it's happened, you can't go back and change something. The Ordo Kronos was established to study the anomalous passage of time during interstellar travel through the warp, because that's a big problem for the Imperium. Time already passes differently for those just travelling in space. Go look it up, because I'm not explaining it yet again here today. But for those who travel in the warp, ships may well arrive at their destination much later than intended. This is why even if a planet sends out a distress call and reinforcements are dispatched immediately by the Imperium, it's very often the case that they will arrive to discover a dead world, because time can't be monitored accurately whilst traversing the warp. So what might have felt like a month in warp travel could in fact pass years on the outside. And it goes both ways as well. Some Chaos Marines have observed that whilst in the warp it felt as if centuries had passed, when in the material real space it had barely been a year. In the most bizarre of circumstances, a ship may even arrive at its destination before it technically departed. These problems are common knowledge amongst void travellers and have to be accepted as one of the risks of warp travel. You might leave your home, and the reason you never see them is because by the time you come back, everybody's died. And that's why for many who travel beyond their own world, they might actually choose to just stay in a local system, because these kind of issues are far less problematic then. But once you're travelling further afield, between systems, between sectors of the galaxy, it's truly only for those who have either nothing tying them to a planet, or for those who transcend mortal life, like the Mechanicus and the Astartes. So does it make sense that the Legion of the Damned are time warriors attempting to set right what once went wrong, hoping that in each appearance this one is going to be the one to get them home? I personally don't think so, and really it's a shambolic concept coming from a member of the Ordo Kronos. Now another less common theory is similar to the one which posits that the Legion are warp extensions of the Emperor's will, except that the idea here is that the Legion are in fact little more than extensions acting at the behest of some malevolent greater being from the warp, possibly Chaos. Of course, there still remains the issue then of Centurius to contend with, but putting that aside, this concept of the Legion of the Damned being demons originates singularly from the Eldar, specifically from one Eldar Autarch, a Lunin Star Shaper, who's quoted as saying, "They're creatures born of the warp, that much even a child could divine. That they wear the shape of mankind's vaunted defenders is a matter as immaterial as the warriors themselves. They are demons, and they must be brought low, just as with all their malefic kind." So this theory relies on you wanting to take the spiteful, embittered word of the Eldari, slandering one of humanity's most revered and glorious defenders. Well, I'll pass on that. So then, the final theory, known as Quadramista's thesis of perpetual martyrdom. That's right, and it was originally commissioned by the High Lords of Terror. The concept is that the Legion is a lost strike force of space marines who have somehow blended with the stuff of the warp. It kind of generally mixes with the other ideas about them, but here the idea is that they have contracted some kind of metaphysical contagion. They fear that this would spread to others, and so they set out to punish the enemies of mankind as best they can, and for as long as they can. But here's the thing. In all honesty, that doesn't really sound like anything like the Legion of the Damned from what we know about them. In this speculation, it also considers that, similarly to the idea about demons, the Legionnaires, when they die, return to the warp, and they can then be reborn after a time again. Given what we know about the Legion, that sort of is correct, but it also sort of doesn't stand up. It speculates that the burning fire seen upon the Legion is just a later stage of development of this warp fire contagion. It also suggests that earlier mentioned concept of the Tarot symbiosis. Quadramista concluded that the warp contagion bestows a great deal of psychic ability on this sufferer, blending their bodies and minds alike with the raw stuff of chaos. And because of this, the Legion is able to read the Emperor's tarot with a surprising degree of accuracy, tapping into the immense psychic prescience of the Master of Mankind, using his abilities to read the future in the swirling tides of the warp. But quite honestly, that's the only aspect of that theory that seems plausible to me. While most of the theorizing of Quadramista can be just shelved, the two observations that are considered accurate are their ability to see the future events with accuracy, to arrive when they're needed, and also that despite their minds and bodies having suffered greatly, somewhere within them, the honour of the Legionnaires is still intact. Their intent is noble. Although I will say, given what we know of the figure titled as Centurius, even that is somewhat called into question. Ultimately, regardless as to their origin, the Legion of the Damned are an inimitable force in the galaxy. They appear with such a force of willpower and presence of purpose that for many enemies of humanity, the very sight of the spectral warriors burning with immaterial flames dancing across their armour, marching down upon them with a silent, locked gaze, ignoring any damage coming toward them, and who ignore any brothers who fall beside them in battle as if it were no matter at all. The Legion of the Damned seem to carry, in the truest sense, no fear of death, for despite their protestations otherwise, even heretics and demons fear death, a true death. For any of those legionnaires who do fall, they seemingly disintegrate and vanish like burned ashes, smouldering away to nothing as if they were never truly there at all. They are a terrifying force, and if their seemingly masterful, irresistible battle skills are not enough in and of themselves to drive the foul Xenos and heretics from the field, then their terrifying presence and unbreakable will may be enough to tip the balance. Wherever the legionnaires appear, the tide of battle turns at a critical moment, tipping the scales of fate in the favour of the Imperium and the true servants of the Emperor. They may be plagued by madness and morbidity, they may be touched by the foul powers of chaos, they may even be amongst the ranks of the fabled undead, but they remain loyal servants of the Imperium. Enemies normally observed as fighting to the last have been seen to break and run from an oncoming march of the Legion of the Damned, but there's something unnerving about them. Even to those Xenos who ordinarily know no fear, they have faltered when facing the Legion of the Damned. Drukhari, who have seen nearly all the horrors the galaxy has to offer, have fallen over themselves when encountering the Legionnaires, one even having had the audacity to tear away the faceplate of a damned Astartes, and whatever it saw within is said to have taken its soul away, as the sheer terror brought the Drukhari's demise. When the many enemies of humanity face the realization that they face not the Emperor's Astartes, not some warp being, but death itself, heretics may fight for a time, but after seeing their kin fall beside them to a true death, the Legion march on and on. Nothing can slow them or resist their will. The inescapable reality of impending eternal destruction is too much for some enemies, but who would stand and argue against death itself? This is what the Legion of the Damned are to the enemies of humanity. Not a foe to be bested, not a company of Astartes to be outwitted and outnumbered. They will weather the most crushing onslaughts of heretic and Xenos firepower, and they will stand, an immovable, immaterial force. When the Legion march forth, the doom of the heretic is the only constant in their reality. The Legion of the Damned are death incarnate, and where they walk, hell follows with them. So let's talk about my next selection for Audible, Void King. This seemed a timely choice given that we literally just spoke about Rogue Traders and it's in the mind and fresh. Plus, it's always difficult to give an in-depth overview for a recommendation without giving too much away. Seeing as this is brand new, this is especially true. But what I'll say is that it's a particularly interesting story because of its positioning in the events of Guilliman's Crusade. This is still a developing storyline, plus it gives some really interesting perspective on the role of rogue traders in the late period of M41. The basic overview is that in the period since the halcyon days of the Great Crusade, several proud noble families have of course been reaping a wealth of profits and making a name for themselves via their expansive warrants of trade, the official documents that enable rogue traders to reach out and engage with the Imperium in ways restricted to almost the entirety of the rest of the Imperium, from a civilian perspective anyway. Now, through the time period of M41, things have changed. The galaxy has seen massive shifts in power and factional control of territory, not to mention, of course, the entire realm of the Imperium has been torn in two by this cicatrix maledictum, the Great Rift. This is where the story becomes interesting, because Guilliman has demanded that rogue traders be sent into this hellish domain, their many millennia of rewards through their warrants of trade, the freedom they've been given, now called in. Their ethical debt to the Imperium is due. So it falls upon Erastus, the Lamartine heir, to rise to the occasion. Can he unite disparate Imperial forces to complete this sacred mission, or will betrayal and a thirst for vengeance threaten their endeavours and keep the dark secrets threatening the Imperium's dreams of unity hidden forever? I will also just throw in a cheeky second recommendation today. As you know, I've been a big fan of the Warhammer crime series, which look at the more ordinary level of Imperium citizens down in the depths of high cities. The third in this series to be translated to audiobook was released recently, and I greatly enjoyed it. The Vorbis Conspiracy. It's well worth a look in if you've been enjoying Warhammer crime as I have, and I hope that they continue to do more of this range in audiobook. As a final reminder, if you're new to all this, you can start listening today, and new members always get that 30-day Audible trial. As a member, you'll get full access to thousands of audiobooks, originals and podcasts included in the Plus catalogue. Visit audible.com/Lutin or text Lutin to 500 if you're in the US. Thanks for your support as always, and I'll see you all in the next one.